For the last few weeks, the ICE Immigration Processing Facility in Broadview, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, has been the scene of intense protests. You've probably seen some of the videos on social media. And it's here that federal agents have also been escalating in their use of force against protesters and journalists. In late September, Charles Thrush, a freelance reporter working for the local digital news startup Block Club, was hit in the hand by a pepper ball fired by a federal agent while he was photographing the scene. According to a statement he later filed in federal court, he was wearing a press badge around his neck, and the shots were fired without warning. Thrush is one of 4 reporters working for Block Club Chicago who've been injured by law enforcement while covering Broadview. Other news outlets have had their reporters arrested or detained. Earlier this week, the publications filed a lawsuit against ICE and Homeland Security, among others, alleging that it's been unconstitutionally impeding the ability of journalists to cover the story. Stephanie Lulay, the co-executive editor and co-founder of Block Club, says that in the publication's 7 years of reporting on the city, they've never encountered this kind of forceful resistance to their journalism from authorities. She and reporter Francia García Hernández joined the Kicker this week to talk about what they've witnessed and about what it's like reporting on a city that's under siege. Well, Francia, Stephanie, thank you both so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thanks for having us.
I'm hoping we can just start with what is going on in Chicago. You guys are covering it, and Block Club has been doing an amazing job. Just, can you give us a sense of what it's like there right now with what's happening with ICE?
So we have seen an increased ICE presence, and not just ICE, but really some other federal agencies, law enforcement, border patrol agencies here in Chicago in the last month or so. After, this came after threats of enhanced immigration enforcement here in Chicago by President Donald Trump, and threats of sending the National Guard to the city.
From afar, and I've been in places where I'm covering a story and it's the national news story, and so I know what it's like, but from afar, it can be hard to tell if what's happening in Chicago is just happening in a couple of discrete places and the rest of the city's carrying on like normal, or if there is a more widespread sense of siege there. How do you guys feel just in general? What's the vibe across the city?
Yeah, Josh, from a news perspective, I can say since Operation Midway Blitz and other federal efforts have happened here in Chicago, things have been incredibly busy for us. It kind of feels like whack-a-mole at times. There's just so much going on. And I can say it really has touched every corner of our city. Certainly, a lot of the immigration efforts are being targeted in majority Latino neighborhoods, of which there are pockets across the city. But we've also seen Border Patrol agents patrolling downtown, including Millennium Park right outside the Bean, arresting people there. So really, if you're in Chicago, I think you are feeling the presence of ICE.
Francia, is that sort of how you see it too?
Yes, definitely. And I would say for some neighborhoods in the city, as Stephanie was mentioning, Latino majority neighborhoods have been seeing this increased presence since the start of September. In some neighborhoods in the southwest side of the city, it has become part of what they see every day. Detentions happening every day, presence of federal agents every day. And sometimes we've seen rapid response teams, which are just organizers and neighbors coming together to verify ICE sightings, report that there is such a heavy presence of agents that they recommend people to avoid travel within the neighborhood if that's possible. That's been happening over the last week or so. So especially in some neighborhoods, I think that activity has been especially visible and very concerning for many of the people who live there.
So it seems like there's things like there's Broadview, right? There's these specific buildings and structures, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what's been going on there, where there's protest activity and there's clearly a kind of stable sense of this is a choke point for activity. But then there's just you're around town and there's ICE agents driving around and they're getting into car accidents and they're chasing people down and they're jumping out of their car and pulling people out of cars, right? Like it has both this sort of predictable pattern, but also a lot of sort of randomness to where this can pop up.
Yes, definitely. I think Broadview is a suburb of Chicago, and it is where ICE and the Department of Homeland Security have a processing center. There are no detention centers in Illinois that we know of because in 2020, Illinois state lawmakers passed some laws to prevent any county jail or any government building to be allowed to be used as a detention facility for ICE. So Broadview
Hmm.
is technically just a processing center where people who get arrested would be processed and then moved out of state. But what we have seen in the last month or so is that this has become also a detention center, according to media reports. And so protesters have been gathering there and just, trying to prevent and denounce the activities that ICE is taking. So we have seen clashes and we have seen federal agents, initially just ICE, then Border Patrol led by Gregory Vivino, using chemical weapons on protesters and journalists.
I want to actually talk a little bit more about that specific last part, sort of what it's like covering this. But there's something you guys, I've noticed how you have in some of your stories that I thought was really interesting. You'll do a story about some activity, and then at the bottom, you'll have some bullets of other ICE sightings. I'm wondering sort of what made you decide to sort of include that as it's almost like you're overwhelmed by this activity, and they can't each get their own article, right? Is there a sort of idea that you want to just sort of blanket cover everything that's happening? And then how are you getting these stories? How are you working with? Are you working with communities that are sharing information about what they're seeing? Because there's not a lot of official information, right?
There isn't a lot of official information, and sometimes the information that we get is very broad. So when ICE has disclosed figures about arrests during Midway Blitz or Operation at Large by CBP, they'll just give us, a broad figure, 450 arrests over the last few days. So one of the things we've been doing is working with community-led rapid response groups that I had mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
And these teams are made up of, organizers, neighbors, and volunteers who are ready to receive tips of ICE presence in the neighborhood, go to wherever that was reported, confirm if it's something that happened, get information on whether there were any arrests, and then report that. That has become increasingly important among neighbors because of the fear and anxiety that just knowing that ICE could be in their neighborhood brings to them. But it's also become a way to know what is happening every day and get a sense of whether ICE is ramping up operations in Chicago. So that's
Mm-hmm.
what we did. Part of what we are trying to do is provide that information on a daily basis, and that's why that's in the story. Because we have seen, and I can say reporting on this, every time there was a threat of hundreds of federal agents coming to the city of Chicago, there was a lot of fear and anxiety, and that led to rumors and false, sometimes false reports of ICE sightings in Chicago,
Mm.
especially on social media. So we see the need for that information. But as you mentioned, the city is huge. There's so much happening, and activity has been ramping up. So just reporting on what the on the ground organizers are seeing and verifying as ICE reports has been important.
And Josh, you ask about the decision to kind of move to, in some cases, this bulleted format, this roundup of actions that we're seeing every day across the city. We made that decision because not only was all of the ICE activity overwhelming to us, but we saw this during COVID too. Information was changing so fast that we worried that it really was overwhelming readers too. So
Mm-hmm.
we wanted to provide sort of like a daily digest where people can just find out if they heard something in their neighborhood. They'll be able to see if we were able to verify it.
So how is ICE responding to your journalism? I mean, ICE has not been in love with certainly unofficial people trying to track ICE activity around cities. How has ICE been handling? Like, what have your encounters been like with them? Either through the press office or directly in person.
I would say at sometimes we get answers to our questions about specific operations or arrests, and some other times we don't get our questions answered and we get a statement that is also often published on social media by the Department of Homeland Security, by Secretary Noem, or by some ICE official. That is sort of what we've encountered. So sometimes we don't get answers to the questions that we're asking. I haven't really interacted with the press office in person. It's mostly been via email and phone communications. So that's what I can share personally as a reporter.
And I believe that CJR has reported about our efforts to kind of shake loose some information, some very basic information about the arrests that are happening here. When this all began, we were making dozens of requests to ICE about the operations here, very basic questions like who was arrested yesterday and what for, or just like information about certain operations that we knew were happening in the city. And we would never get a response. That led to us FOIAing for some information. Those FOIAs lapsed. We kept trying to re-engage with them, and it ended with us filing a lawsuit to try and shake loose some of these records that the public really is entitled to under the law. Asking, again, very basic questions. How many people have been arrested? Who are they? What were they arrested for? Where are they now? All information that we know ICE has. And we sued for that information back in May. Where we're at now with the lawsuit, they have provided some records, but none of the records that they have provided so far to us include identifying information like, again, those names, what people were arrested for, their addresses, or where these arrests happen. We want that information as journalists so we can, reach out to the people who were arrested and their families to sort of verify some of the information that ICE is giving us and really to be able to tell deeper stories about what's happening in our city. So we continue to fight for that information as part of this lawsuit.
Can we talk a little bit about what your reporters and I think others in the Chicago press have experienced on the ground with ICE? It's not necessarily always directed at reporters, but there have been a number of incidents of tear gas. I think you guys had one of your reporters, or maybe it was a freelancer, who was hit with a rubber bullet. Is that right?
Yes, Josh, that's correct. 4 of our journalists have been shot with pepper spray bullets.
Oh, wow. I
Yeah,
didn't realize it was that many. Yeah.
Yeah, and tear gassed while covering protests outside the Broadview ICE facility. It's happened on more than one occasion. Also, outside of our newsroom, an independent reporter was arrested. A TV reporter's truck was hit with a pepper ball, which left her with chemicals all across her face. She said that she was throwing up for hours afterwards. And I can say that just like never in Block Club's 7 years of on the ground reporting have our journalists been so indiscriminately attacked. And, we've covered tense scenes before, including 2020 and 2021's unrest here in our city.
I mean, I think that's what I was going to ask is like how much of this is just the sort of perils of reporting on protests and clashes with authority that people always get hurt in various ways, or do you guys have a sense that there is either targeting of reporters or just more indiscriminate use of these tactics?
We believe that the ICE action and action by other federal authorities in our city, point blank, it's affecting our ability to report. Our journalists have a right to report what is going on in our city without fear of violence or arrest. And that's a right protected under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. What's happening right now in our city is affecting our ability to report.
Can you tell me just a little bit about the lawsuit that was filed recently?
After I told you 4 of our journalists have been shot with those pepper spray bullets and tear gassed out at Broadview. After that, and a series of other targeting of journalists has happened, or other journalists have been affected by ICE's actions and other federal agents while working out at Broadview. We joined a lawsuit with other organizations that represent reporters across our city and state, and we're suing the federal government right now over agents' actions against journalists at Broadview. The goal of this lawsuit, we're not seeking money or anything like that. We're being represented pro bono. The goal of the lawsuit is to seek an injunction to bar federal agents from, among other things, indiscriminately using chemical weapons against journalists.
Mm-hmm. Fronty, have you been out at some of these scenes, or have you talked to colleagues who have been there? I mean, what's the experience of reporting? Because again, I think having covered protests and having covered protests that have become violent at times, there's a slightly different mindset when you go out and say, okay, I'm going to go out into the middle of the night where there's some chaos going on versus I'm going to go cover what I thought was a peaceful protest. And now I never know when it's going to turn violent. And the violence might even come from the law enforcement side initially. What's that experience of, like, as a reporter?
I've spoken to colleagues and I've been covering a lot of what's happening in the neighborhoods, also have been at Broadview even before protests ramped up there as, lawmakers try to visit and inspect the conditions inside the facility. And
Hmm.
my colleagues at Broadview just saw the protests ongoing and then the escalation of federal agents' tactics to, control protesters, or what they say is control protesters, and even affecting journalists happening. I would say fairly quickly over, from one protest to the next, things were escalating. So I wouldn't say it fully took reporters by surprise, but we've all been prepping for possible scenarios, especially after seeing the scenes of what happened in LA as the National Guard and federal agencies increased immigration enforcement operations there. So there's a sense of preparedness, but there's also a sense of when things happen, then there is an escalation. You have to react to that and try to look out for safety and reporter safety and your colleague safety as well.
I mean, are you at a escalated level of risk now if you're going to go out and risk assessment? If you're going to go out and cover, just spend a couple hours outside Broadview, you're going to bring gear, you're going to bring gas masks now? Is that kind of where you're at?
Correct. Yes, our colleagues have been bringing gear to cover the protests at Broadview, and we're all recommended to have that, required, I should say, to have personal protection equipment if we're covering protests at Broadview or otherwise protests or similar types of events related to immigration enforcement right now.
And piggybacking off of that, Francia, too, not only have we equipped our journalists who are covering Broadview with goggles, gas masks, all of that sort of equipment that they might need, we've also instituted a policy after these journalists were shot with pepper spray bullets that they be teamed up, that there's always a photographer and reporter together, or two reporters together, just so if something happened, that there would be somebody who could get word back to the newsroom. And that's a policy that we've instituted after this violence that our journalists have faced.
Just to pull back a little, I mean, I think there's this danger of, maybe I'm thinking about listeners not fully processing how much of a shift this is to, like, we have all covered protests a billion times, and there's clearly something different going on. At least it really seems like it, in how the authorities are willing to use force in response to the protests. And then, I mean, we've seen videos of local Chicago police getting tear gas. There's just a kind of, I don't know. I mean, indiscriminate is the word we keep coming back to, but a willfulness to use these escalated tactics that make journalism harder that I think is quite extraordinary.
I think what you mentioned has been something that we've seen circulating as well, because at Broadview, we were seeing the use of chemical weapons before we saw them being used more frequently within the city's neighborhoods. But last week, we reported that on Friday, federal agents inside a car threw gas and what appeared to be a smoke grenade in a neighborhood street where people were standing. And then later Saturday, we saw scenes out of the Brighton Park neighborhood here in Chicago where federal agents used pepper spraying and smoke again. And we saw those videos circulating of even Chicago police getting sprayed with tear gas. So we're seeing those tactics that were initially being used in Broadview also used around the city where federal agents are conducting their enforcement operations, or whenever they're encountering protests, or sometimes it just feels like that's a technique they're using to maybe intimidate people who are filming or documenting this activity.
Yeah, to give you an idea of just how much activity is happening and how indiscriminate some of it does feel, or just how out of the ordinary for us some of this action feels. Last Friday alone, we were telling neighbors about an older person who was detained by ICE in a hospital's emergency room. That's very out of the ordinary for us. And this
Mm-hmm.
was all happening too as smoke bombs were deployed on a busy Logan Square street as people were grocery shopping, including a family with a 2-year-old. That's in addition to all of the ICE arrests that are happening in the city. So there's just a lot going on. And some of the action does feel very indiscriminate.
How does this de-escalate, or is that hard to imagine with the National Guard rollout? And what are you expecting if they actually do arrive on the streets of Chicago?
That's a good question. I don't think I know the answer on how to de-escalate, especially when, as Stephanie mentioned, we've seen federal agents using smoke and tear gas in a neighborhood street where, people were just grocery shopping and walking around their neighborhood. So when that's an action that's being taken by federal agents, I don't know that I can, know how they could de-escalate. Certainly the lawsuit that we talked about could do something about the use of these tactics, but what we are expecting is something similar to what we saw in Los Angeles earlier this year, but we've also seen the National Guard deployed to Washington, D.C. So I think it's hard to tell, but we do know that we could continue to see an increased presence of federal immigration agents. We could continue to see immigration arrests happening. We could continue to see the use of tear gas and smoke and other chemical weapons unless a court orders differently.
Stephanie, before we go, can you talk a little bit about how Block Club is meeting this moment? Do you feel like this is kind of what you guys were built for, or is this forcing you to sort of change some of the things about how you cover the city?
I think it's a little bit of both, Josh. Black Club was founded as a nonprofit newsroom focused on Chicago's neighborhoods. We have reporters, I hesitate to use the word deployed. We have reporters embedded in neighborhoods across the city. And
Unfortunately, I have to say
yeah,
that military language almost naturally sneaks in, and and I get the hesitance to use it, but it's like it feels there's a resonance there. I get it. So,
right. So our reporters are embedded in neighborhoods all across the city. And, they're assigned to cover just 2 or 3 neighborhoods, and they are really tasked with covering whatever neighbors are talking about that day. We believe that this model leads to a more accurate portrayal of our neighborhoods over time. We believe that it leads to better stories, and we believe that it leads to trust with neighbors, that just our neighbors are going to trust us more when they know their reporter. So many people in Little Village and Pilsen know Francia well. Bottom line, we think it just leads to better news. And so I say that it's a little bit of both because, certainly if we didn't have federal agents descending on our city, our news would look different. But I think we have done our best to meet the moment. And that just means every day we're asking ourselves, what do people need to know? And that could mean building know your rights guides for people who are interacting with ICE in English and Spanish. It could mean just updates on arrests and other actions that people are seeing across our neighborhoods. It could mean telling people about their alderman that was arrested interacting with ICE or smoke bombs that were deployed on their neighborhood. We've really prioritized arrest and other need to know information from the ground. National news that affects our city. So, like the latest on the National Guard troops being sent here, or what the president is saying about our mayor and governor
mm-hmm,
and our
mm-hmm.
people. It could mean a big part of our mission is just showing, like I said, an accurate portrayal of the neighborhood. And Chicago is so, in a lot of ways, it's really demonized by the national media. So we really want to show the true Chicago that we know and show stories of how neighbors are helping across our city. Just today, we rolled out a story about neighbors that are showing up at a school with perhaps like a high Latino population, a number of Latino students, and parents are volunteering to show up at pick up and drop off to basically act as like shields.
Mm.
To make sure that the kids are getting in and out of the school safely, and that if ICE showed up, that they would be able to intervene. So, there's so many of those stories that about how neighbors are helping across our city. Another one that I really loved that Francia worked on, a street vendor, a popular street vendor was arrested by ICE. Neighbors in that neighborhood rallied to keep their cart going so they could keep making money from it even though they are being detained. We have stories like this all across the city, so we want to make sure that even amid all of this news crush, that we're also telling the real stories about how neighbors are trying to help each other during this time.
Thank you both so much for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Really appreciate it.
The Kicker is brought to you by the Columbia Journalism Review and produced by Amanda Dara. I'm your host, Josh Hirsch.